Hello everyone, and hope you're doing well today. Today's daf is Bava kamma, daf 88 Omid Beast. Let's dive straight in. Rav Shmuel Ba'aba went before Rabbi Yirmiyah Ba'aba to claim his mother's property. Rabbi Yirmiyah established him as the owner of the property in accordance with what was written in the document. Rabbi Abba, the mother's husband, went and said a report of the matter to Rav Hoshaya. Rav Hoshaya went and said a report of the matter before Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said to Rav Hoshaya, "This is what Shmuel says. In a case of a woman who sold a usufruct property, if a woman sold her usufruct property during her husband's lifetime, the husband retains the right to the produce during her lifetime and takes possession of the actual property after her death without having to reimburse the purchasers. This was the ordinance of Usha." Mama Sefer Nashim Hilchot Yishud 22:7 Shulchan Aruch Eben Ezer 99. Which belongs to her, but whose profits her husband garners in her husband's lifetime, and then she died. The husband repossesses the property from the purchasers. Since the husband inherits from his wife, he is considered to have purchased the property before it came into possession of the one to whom his wife sold it. Rashi. The granting of a property by means of the document is analogous to a sale, and Rabbi Abba can repossess the property from Rav Shmuel Abba. The sages said that halacha before Rabbi Yirmiyah Abba, who had ruled that the property belongs to Shmuel Abba. He said to them, "I know the Mishnah that supports my opinion, as we learned in the Mishnah Bava Batra 136a, in a case of one who writes a document transferring ownership of his property to his son. If one writes a bill transferring ownership of his property to his son after he dies, the son owns the property from the date recorded on the document. The right to the produce are retained by the father as long as he lives. Neither of them is able to sell this property. If the father proceeds to sell the property, the rights to produce are sold until he dies, whereupon those rights are transferred to his son. The son must pay the purchaser for any produce still attached to the ground at the time of the transfer. If there is produce already detached from the ground, or even produce ready to be harvested, the purchaser keeps it. The Ramah notes that some hold all produce attached to the ground is transferred to the son, Torah site in the Rashbam. If the son proceeds to sell the property, the purchaser does not have any rights to it until the father dies, whereupon he takes full possession of them. If the son sold the property during his father's lifetime and then predeceased his father, the purchaser still takes possession of it after the father dies, and the father is the owner of the rights to the produce alone, and the ownership of the rights to use an item and to its produce is not considered to be like ownership of the item itself, in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish, Rambam Sefer Kinan Hilchot Zikim Matana 12:13 Shulchan Aruch Chesham Mizbah 257 1 3-5. Saying that the transfer should take effect immediately, but the son will have use of it only after the father's death. So he cannot sell the property due to the fact that it is still in the father's possession. And the father, even though he retained the right to use the property, cannot sell the property due to the fact that it is written as belonging to the son. If the father sold the property, then it is sold to the extent that the purchaser may use it until the father dies. If the son sold the property during his father's lifetime, the purchaser does not have a right to use the property until the father dies. Rabbi Yirmiyah Abba infers, in any event, if the son stole the property during his father's lifetime, when the father dies, the purchaser has the right to the property. And this would be so even though it is a case where the son died in the father's lifetime, where the property never came into the son's possession. Rabbi Yirmiyah Abba's analysis is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who says there is no difference if the son died in the father's lifetime, where the property never came into the son's possession, and there is no difference if the father died in the son's lifetime, where the property came into the son's possession. In any event, the purchaser acquired the property. The Gemara will cause a dispute between Amoraim with regard to this point. As was stated, in a case where the son sold the property in the father's lifetime, and the son died in the father's lifetime, Rabbi Yochanan said the purchaser did not acquire the property. He said the purchaser acquired the property. The Gemara explains the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said the purchaser did not acquire the property because he could have said to you, when the mission teaches that if the son sold the property during the father's life, then the purchaser does not acquire any rights to use the property until the father dies. And one going further, when the father dies, the purchaser has rights to the property. The mission is discussing a case where the son did not die during the father's lifetime. So the property came into the son's possession upon the father's death before the purchaser acquired it. But if the son died in the father's lifetime, so the property did not come into the son's possession, in this case, there was not even one moment when the son was the absolute owner of the property, therefore he does not have the ability to sell it to the purchaser. Then even when the father died, the purchaser does not have rights to the property. The Gemara comments, apparently Rabbi Yochanan holds that the ownership of rights to use an item and to its produce is considered to be like the ownership of the item itself. Kinyan Peiros. The dispute between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, which appears in several places in the Talmud, seems to hinge upon the question of whether abstract ownership of property not accompanied by any actual usage rights is legal significance. According to Reish Lakish, ownership rights and usage rights are two distinct entities and can therefore be held by two separate people. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the usage of property cannot be separated from the ownership of that property. Even though the property itself did not belong to the father, it is as though the father owned the property because all the property belonged to him in practice. Therefore, when the son sold the property, he sold the property that did not belong to him. The Gemara explains the opinion of Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that the purchaser acquired the property based on this claim. When the Mishnah teaches that if the son stole the property during his father's lifetime, the purchaser does not have any right to use the property until the father dies, and one can infer that in any case, when the father dies, the purchaser has rights to the property. The Mishnah means that there is no difference if the son did not die in the father's lifetime, when the property came into the son's possession, and there is no difference if the son died in the father's lifetime, where the property did not come into the son's possession. In either case, the purchaser acquired the property. The Gemara comments, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish holds that ownership of the rights to use the item and to its produce is not considered to be like ownership of the item itself, and therefore when the son stole the property, he sold the property that belonged to him. The Gemara returns to the discussion of the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, and now for us, whether if one discusses the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba and whether one discusses the opinion of Rav Yehuda, they both hold according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that ownership of rights to use an item and to its produce is not considered to be like ownership of the item itself. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba says, if it enters your mind that ownership of the rights to use an item and to its produce is considered to be like ownership of the item itself, then when the father dies and the son had died in the father's lifetime, why does the purchaser have rights to the property? When the son sold it, didn't he sell property that did not belong to him? Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from the Mishnah that ownership of the rights to use an item and to its produce is not considered to be like ownership of the item itself? Therefore, Rav Shmuel bar Abba should receive the property transferred to him by his mother, as the fact that the husband owned the rights to its produce does not limit her ability to transfer property to his son. The sages brought back Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba's reply before Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said to them, this is what Shmuel said. This halacha that a husband can repossess the property that his wife stole before she died is not some halacha of our Mishnah concerning a father who transferred his property to his son while retaining the right to garner the profits. The Gemara asks, what is the reasoning for distinguishing between the two cases? Rav Yosef said, granted, if the Mishnah taught the opposite and say that in the case of one who writes a document transferring ownership of his property to his father after his death, while with the son retaining the right to garner the profits until then, the father sold the property during the son's lifetime and purchase rights to the property after the son dies, then it is possible to resolve from the Mishnah that the ownership of rights to use an item and to the produce itself is not considered to be like ownership of the item itself. Rav Yosef continues, but now the Mishnah teaches specifically one who writes a document transferring ownership of his property to his son. The ability of the son to sell the property is due to the fact that the son is fit to inherit it from him. Rashi explains that since in any event the son would have inherited the property from the father when his father died, the reason why the father would choose to deed ownership of the property in his lifetime and the right of usage would be only to grant his son the ability to sell the future ownership of the land while the father is still alive. Thus, the Beit Poet suggests that one could ascribe to the father a different intention, i.e., that he wishes to deny himself the ability to sell the land to another. They therefore offer an alternative explanation, similar to that of the wife, that the son, as the future inheritor of the field, is viewed as having rights to the produce of the field even now. Consequently, in this case, the father's ownership rights to the produce are not sufficient to consider him the owner of the field itself, and already has a right to the property, and not just due to the existence of the document. In the case of Rav Shmuel bar Abba as well, the woman's property is inherited by her husband and not her son, so she cannot transfer it to Rav Shmuel bar Abba. Abai said to Rav Yosef, Is this to say that a son inherits from a father, but a father does not inherit from a son? Since the decisive fact is not the actual inheriting of the property, but the fact that the son potentially can inherit the property from his father, the converse would also apply that the father's potential right to inherit from the son reinforces his position as the owner even now. There is no difference between their right to inherit from one another. Rather, even if the Mishnah taught a halacha concerning a son transferring his property to his father, the son's reason for doing so could have been that he comes to hide his property from his own son and wants his father to inherit from him instead. Here too, when a father transfers his property to his son, he comes to hide his property from his son's brothers, as the father has other sons but does not want them to inherit from him. Therefore, the Mishnah's choice of case cannot serve as a basis for inference. Abai continues, rather, what was Shmuel's reason for saying that the right of a husband to the property that his wife sold before she died is not similar to our Mishnah that states that a father does not have the rights to property sold by his son? The difference is due to the rabbinic ordinance of Usha. Tikanash Usha. The town of Usha in the Galilee was for a time the seat of the Sanhedrin. According to the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah 31a, during the period of the destruction of the second temple, God began to withdraw his divine presence from the temple. In parallel, the Sanhedrin removed itself as well, first relocating within the city of Jerusalem and ultimately to the Galilee. It was initially transplanted to Yavne and from there to Usha, Sepharim, Beit She'arim, Sipor, and Tiberias. While in Usha, the Sanhedrin instituted many ordinances relating to the various areas of halacha, including ritual purity and monetary laws. Although the sages disagree with regard to the exact date of Usha's ordinances, it was seen that they were instituted after the affair of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, approximately 70 years after the destruction of the temple. The ordinances of Usha were not codified in the mission, but were nevertheless accepted by the Amoraim, whose Rabbi Yossi bar Hanina recognized as the leading expert. With this ordinance, the sages provided the husband with additional right to the wife's property, beyond those of other purchases. The early commentaries asked, since according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, ownership of the right to use an item and to its produce is considered to be like ownership of the item itself, why was there a need for the ordinance of Usha? As in any event, the wife could not sell her unfulfilled property. The Rashba, in fact, writes that Rabbi Yochanan would deny the validity of this ordinance, which, as Gemara notes later on, was not universally accepted. Tosfot explained that even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, there are cases where the ordinance is relevant. For example, if the husband grants his wife the right to the produce of the property and does not retain any rights for himself during his wife's lifetime, the ordinance of Usha would still enable him to repossess the field from the one who purchased it from his wife. The Rosh writes that there is a distinction between the right to the produce that the father retained for himself when he transferred the property to his son, and the right to the produce enjoyed by the husband. In the former case, the father possessed ownership of both the property itself and the rights to the produce, and his partial transfer of ownership is not enough to weaken his status as owner. Because the husband never had ownership rights to the property, and his ownership was always limited to profiting from the produce alone, this more limited ownership of rights to the produce would not be sufficient to consider him the owner, even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Therefore, the ordinance of Usha was effective even according to his opinion. Others explain that if not for the ordinance of Usha, the husband would be viewed as one who inherited land from his wife, which would then require him to reimburse money given by those who purchased land from her. The ordinance of Usha causes him to be viewed as one who purchased the land before his wife sold it to others, and he would not be required to reimburse them. An ordinance instituted with regard to a husband's rights to his wife's property. As Rabbi Yossi bar Hanina says, in the town of Usha, the sages instituted that in the case of a woman who sold her unfulfilled property in her husband's lifetime and then died, the husband repossessed it from the purchasers. This ordinance was instituted only for the benefit of a husband and not for the benefit of a father or son. Rabbi Edi bar Avin said, we too learn of the ordinance of Usha in the Baita. If witnesses said, we testify about so-and-so that he divorced his wife and gave the full value of the obligation recorded in a marriage contract, like a subasa, a marriage contract, the marriage contract given by the husband to his wife, this is legal obligation towards her during and after their marriage. For the purposes of the discussion in this Gemara, it is important to note the marriage contract includes information pertaining to the financial benefits the wife receives in the case of the termination of the marriage, even through the death of her husband while she's still alive or through divorce. Primary among these are a sum of money that the husband obligates himself to pay. The main sum is fixed minimally at 100 dinars for a widow or divorcee and 200 dinars for a virgin bride. Additionally, the marriage contract lists the property that the wife brings to the marriage. As these properties must be returned to her in some manner if the marriage is terminated, as Gamal will note later on. When discussing the payment or sale of a marriage contract, refers to the sum of money due to be paid to the wife and the properties of the wife are intended. Thank you for listening and wish you a very good day. All the best. Bye.